There is a tablet in the Nippur collection that describes Mars. Not the red, dead world we see through telescopes. Mars before something happened to it. Mars with 3 oceans, a green band across its middle, and cities built along the coastlines. The tablet names the people who lived on those coasts. It records what they built, and it records in careful sequential detail what came for them. For a century it was catalogued as a hymn. Then 4 scholars, working separately, read it again. They concluded it was a survivor report, and some of the survivors, it says, came here. The tablet itself is small, roughly the size of a paperback book, 4 fingers thick, inscribed on both faces and along one edge. The clay is unusually dense, denser than the clay of the tablet stored around it, dense enough that the woman who eventually noticed it said it felt wrong in the hand before she read a single sign. The script on its faces is Old Babylonian cuneiform, but beneath that script, visible where the surface is worn, there is an older sign system, not erased, overlaid. As if the scribe who made this tablet was copying something far older, line for line, sign for sign, without translating it. Preserving it the way you preserve something you no longer fully understand but know you must not lose. The tablet came out of Nippur, came out in one of the large excavation seasons around the turn of the 20th century, packed into a crate with hundreds of others, shipped, stored and forgotten. When it was finally catalogued decades later, the cataloguer examined it briefly and wrote a single word on the entry card. That word in English was hymn, a religious poem about a distant realm, nothing more. And because that word sat on that card, no one read the tablet as anything else for the next 40 years. The catalogue card decided what the tablet was allowed to be. That is how archives work, that is how records die. The card was wrong. 4 people found out, not together, not as a team. 4 separate scholars in 3 countries, working on projects that had nothing to do with each other, and nothing, at first, to do with this tablet. The first was a philologist in Chicago. Her specialty was the least glamorous corner of the field: grain ledgers, shipping manifests, receipts, thousands of them. And in that ocean of accounting, she began to notice something. A particular determinative sign, the kind of marker Sumerian scribes attached to a word to tell you what category of thing it named, kept appearing in supposedly religious texts in exactly the same grammatical position it occupied in the manifests. In the manifests, that sign meant one thing only: a physical location, a real place you could ship goods to, not a heaven, not a metaphor, a destination. She wrote a short, cautious paper about it in 1979. Almost no one read it. She put the question aside and went back to her ledgers. The second was a translator in Berlin. He had spent his entire career on astronomical texts, and over that career he had built something no one else had: a database of every celestial term in the Sumerian corpus. Every word for a star, a planet, an orbit, a colour in the sky. When a colleague mentioned the Nippur hymn to him in passing, he ran its vocabulary through his database, mostly out of habit. 11 of its terms came back as matches. Not religious matches. Technical matches. Words used elsewhere only in observational astronomy. Words for orbital position. Words for planetary hue. Words for surface features seen at distance. 11 technical terms in a poem about the afterlife. He did not believe in coincidences of that size. The third was a woman in Baghdad, working in the storage rooms of the Iraq Museum in the years before the wars closed them. Her task was physical inventory. Open the crate, confirm the object, check the card, move on. When she reached this tablet, she stopped. The clay did not match the tablets around it. The signs were too clean, too regular, cut by a hand that was copying with unusual care. And then she did the one thing the cataloguer, decades earlier, had not done. She turned the tablet on its side and read the edge. The catalogue card had never mentioned an edge inscription, but there was one, in plain Sumerian, running the full length of the tablet. According to her notes, it read, "The record of what the sky people saw before their sky burned." That is not a phrase from any hymn. That is a title. That is a label a scribe puts on a document so that whoever finds it will know what they are holding. The fourth was not a scholar at all. He was a retired engineer in Osaka who had taught himself cuneiform after retirement and who read the photographic plates in published catalogues the way other retirees read crossword puzzles. In one section of the Nippur tablet, he noticed a sequence of numbers that the standard reading treated as ritual quantities. The numbers bothered him. They were too irregular for ritual, too structured for accident. So he did what an engineer does. He assumed they were measurements and tested units until one fit. When he assumed the unit was a specific Sumerian measure of length scaled up, the numbers resolved into distances, and the distances matched within a small margin the actual distance from Earth to Mars at different points in the Earth-Mars orbital cycle. He wrote a polite letter to the Berlin translator laying out the arithmetic. The letter was 3 pages long. It changed everything. The four of them found each other slowly, through letters and conference margins between 1981 and 1982. Once they understood they were holding 4 corners of the same object, they spent the next 4 years working through the tablet together, line by line, sign by sign, arguing over nearly every clause. The philologist anchored the place names. The Berlin translator anchored the astronomy. The Baghdad researcher supplied fresh photographs of the edge and the worn underscript. The engineer checked every number. In 1985, they published their complete translation in a small European journal with a limited print run and no institutional weight. The mainstream Assyriology community did not attack the paper. It did something quieter. It ignored it. No rebuttal, no review, no citation. The journal itself ceased operations in 1987, and the 4 scholars never published together again. The catalogue card in the Nippur collection still says him. It has never been corrected. But copies of the 1985 translation survive, and what they contain page by page is the reason this video exists. Quick pause, and this is something new. Alongside this series, there is now a second document called the 7 Resets. Every recorded erasure matched against what happened to Mars, plus the checklist of signs for the 8th. 4 of those signs are already active. Link below, QR code on screen. That is all. Back to the record. What follows in the next section is what the tablet actually says. The scholars translated it in order, and the order matters. It begins with a correction. It begins with the colour of the planet. The tablet insists, in its very first line, that the colour we see is not the colour that was. The red, according to the tablet, is a scar. The tablet opens the description proper with a single line, and the 4 scholars agreed that this line sets the frame for everything that follows. In their settled translation it reads, "The red place was not always red." That is the first sentence of the record. Not an invocation, not a prayer, a correction. The people who preserved this record knew exactly what colour the 4th planet showed from Earth in their own time, and they wanted their readers to understand before anything else that the colour was recent. The colour was damage. The red, according to the tablet, is what was left after everything else was taken. Then the tablet describes the world as it was. It names 3 continents, and it names them in the order you would encounter them if you approached the planet from the direction of the sun and moved across its face as it turned. The first continent is called, in the Sumerian, the wide land of the morning ocean. The second is called the narrow land between the 2 waters. The third is called the far land under the third ocean, and the tablet is specific that this third continent was mostly submerged, with only its mountain ranges rising above the water as long chains of islands. The oceans are named too. The morning ocean covered the northern part of the planet, wrapping around the top of the world. The middle ocean was the smallest, a warm inland sea between the first and second continents, shallow enough, the tablet says, to be crossed on foot at certain seasons. The third ocean was the deepest and the coldest, and it covered most of the southern hemisphere. And the tablet is careful, unusually careful, to say that none of this was permanent. It says the oceans had risen and fallen many times within the memory of the coastal peoples. It refers to older maps kept in a repository on the second continent that showed previous geographies. Some of those maps showed a single supercontinent surrounded by one global ocean. Others showed arrangements close to the 3-ocean world, but with different coastlines. The people of this planet understood their world as a world that had already been many worlds. They kept the old maps the way we keep photographs of the dead. Across the middle latitudes of all 3 continents ran what the tablet calls the green band, a wide belt of vegetation, not forest as we would recognise forest. Low, dense, heavy with pale flowers that opened at night. The green band was where the food came from. It was the agricultural spine of the entire planet. And at 3 points, where the green band met the ocean, the largest coastal cities had been built. Now, the peoples. The tablet gives 3 names, 1 for each continent. On the first continent lived the people the tablet calls the tall ones with pale skin. On the second continent lived the small ones with copper skin. On the third continent lived the ones who lived partly in water, and these are described as having skin that changed colour with temperature and depth. 3 distinct populations, and all 3, according to the tablet, descended from a single ancestor group that had arrived on the planet from somewhere else, many generations before the record begins. The tall ones were the most numerous. Their principal city stood on the northern edge of the first continent, where the morning ocean curved into a long bay. The tablet gives the city a name that translates approximately as the place where the light first touches the water. It describes a city built partly on land and partly on great platforms extending over the shallow water of the bay. The buildings were of pale stone, quarried, the tablet says, from mountains 3 full days inland. And the tablet claims this city held more people than any city on Earth at the time the record was written down. The scribe who wrote that had seen the cities of Sumer. He was not easily impressed. The small ones with copper skin were fewer, but they were the most technologically advanced of the 3. Their principal settlement stood on the western coast of the second continent, at the mouth of a river draining the interior highlands. The city was compact and vertical, built of dark stone cut and fitted without mortar. The tablet describes towers so tall that its writers had no unit for the height. They used a comparison instead. The towers, the tablet says, were taller than the cliffs at the edge of the world. Whatever that phrase meant to the people who wrote it, it meant something they had no other way to say. The ones who lived partly in water were the smallest population, and the strangest to the record keepers. Their settlements were not cities at all. They were networks of shallow reefs, artificial islands, and structures descending below the surface of the third ocean to depths no air-breathing being could reach. These people spent part of every day submerged and part on the surface, and they held the oldest archives because their submerged repositories were protected from the surface weather that, over thousands of years, wore away nearly everything on the other 2 continents. The 3 peoples were not 3 civilizations. The tablet is clear on this. They spoke a common language, or at least a common technical language for trade and record keeping. They ran shipping routes across all 3 oceans. They were, in every sense that matters, one planetary civilization wearing 3 different bodies. And that civilization was old. Using a calendar system the 4 scholars could only partially reconstruct, the tablet estimates its continuous age at roughly 50,000 of our years before the events it goes on to describe. But there was something on that planet older still. The tablet describes structures on the highest interior peaks, structures the coastal peoples did not build, did not fully understand and yet maintained, generation after generation. The structures were aligned to fixed stars, alignments that only make sense if their builders were tracking something across thousands of years. The coastal peoples called those builders the ones who came before the coming. In the later Sumerian record, another name for those same builders survives. That name is Anunnaki, and connected to those structures, the tablet describes the Sky Watchers, observation posts in the interior highlands, staffed in rotation by members of all 3 peoples. Their duty was to watch one specific region of the sky for something the record calls only the return. The tablet never explains what the return was. It says only that the watching had continued for as long as anyone remembered. 50,000 years of watching, 50,000 years of nothing. Then, roughly 200 years before the events the tablet describes, the Watchers recorded a change. Certain stars in that region began very slowly to dim, and then to redden. The timing of periodic events in the sky began to shift. The instruments were old, but the records were consistent. And the coastal civilizations understood, all 3 of them, at almost the same moment, what the records meant. The return had begun. Before the war, stop for a second. What you are about to hear only makes sense on the full timeline, next to the 6 erasures that came before it. Same warnings, same sequence. It is all in the 7 resets linked below. Grab it, come back, what is next builds on it. QR code is on your screen. The war, as the tablet describes it, did not begin the way a war on Earth begins. There was no border, there was no dispute, there was an arrival. For roughly a century, the Sky Watchers had tracked the slow reddening of a small cluster of stars in the one region of the sky they had been assigned to watch. Then, in a period the tablet fixes precisely by the position of the 4th planet in its orbit, the reddening resolved. The stars had not been dimming because of anything happening inside the stars. They had been dimming because something very large was passing in front of them. Something dark, something on a trajectory into the inner system. The Watchers had not been watching stars at all. They had been watching a silhouette. The tablet says the coastal civilizations had roughly 40 of our years between the moment the Watchers understood what they were seeing and the moment the arriving thing reached the 4th planet. 40 years is not a short time. It is a full working lifetime. And the 3 peoples used it. They built what the tablet calls the reaching structures. The record does not describe what these were, only that they were raised at great cost on all 3 continents and that they failed. They moved records. Entire archives were carried inland from the coastal cities, copied, divided, and buried in prepared vaults in the highlands. On the 3rd continent, the oldest archives were carried downward instead, into the deep submerged repositories where no surface event could reach them, and they evacuated, not everyone. The tablet is honest about this. A portion of the population chosen by methods the record does not explain was moved from the coastal cities into shelters cut into the interior mountains. The cities themselves kept functioning almost to the end. The tablet says the lights of the place where the light first touches the water were still burning on the final night. Someone recorded that detail. Someone thought it mattered. It does. They also tried to speak with what was coming. The tablet says that during the final years of the approach, the coastal civilizations established some form of contact with the arriving force. How, the record does not say. What was said in either direction, the record does not say. The 4 scholars searched for that passage for years, convinced it had to exist somewhere in the War Nondescript. It does not exist. What exists instead is the aftermath of the exchange, and that passage, the scholars noted, they translated with unusual confidence because the terminology is stark and specific. After the exchange, the tablet says, the coastal peoples understood 2 things. They understood that they were not going to be allowed to remain, and they understood that the arriving force did not intend to occupy their world. It intended to unmake it. Not conquest, not settlement, removal. The distinction mattered to the writers of the tablet, and they preserved it precisely. Whatever was said in that exchange, the answer that came back was not a demand. It was a notification. The weapon. This is the section of the tablet that the 4 scholars fought over longest. Not because the signs were damaged, because the signs were clear, and what they described had no category. The weapon is not described as an object. It is not a projectile, not a fire, not a flood. The weapon is described as a condition, a change imposed on the air of the planet from outside. The tablet says the arriving force did not need to land. It stopped at a fixed distance above the 2nd continent, above the vertical city of the copper-skinned people, and it did something to the atmosphere. Something that removed most of the air of the world in a period the tablet gives as roughly 1 turning of the 4th planet against its own axis. In modern terms, roughly a day, 1 day. The 4 scholars noted that the closest analogue in modern physics would be a sustained stripping of the upper atmosphere by directed radiation of a kind we cannot produce and have no clear theoretical model for. They wrote that sentence in 1985. No model has appeared since. For the people sheltering in the interior, the event had a sound. The tablet is specific about this, more specific than about almost anything else. A single continuous sound heard through rock, through the walls of the shelters, for the entire duration, not thunder, not wind. One unbroken tone that did not rise and did not fall. It lasted the whole turning of the planet. And then it stopped, not faded. Stopped. The tablet says the silence afterward was total, and that when the survivors dared to look out from the shelter mouths, the sky was full of stars in the middle of the day. That is the line the 4 scholars could not move past. Stars at midday, because that is not poetry. That is what a sky looks like when the air is gone. When the atmosphere went, the water followed, not at once. Over the following decades, according to the tablet, the water of the 3 oceans either froze into the ground or escaped upward into the dark, or was drawn down into the deep crust. The morning ocean became a basin. The warm middle sea became a salt plain. The 3rd ocean, the deepest, held out longest, shrinking year by year around the drowned mountains of the far land. The green band died in the first years. The pale night flowers, the tablet says, bloomed one last season under the airless sky, and did not open again. The coastal cities stood empty and intact. There was no fire to burn them, and no weather left to wear them. The tall ones, the copper-skinned ones, the ones who lived partly in water, those still on the planet either died where they sheltered, or made their way to the last habitable place, the deep submerged repositories beneath the shrinking 3rd ocean. There, the tablet says, a small population survived for a period of centuries after the atmospheric loss. They kept records to the end. Then the records stop. The tablet marks the stopping with a single sign repeated 3 times, which the scholars translated as silence, silence, silence. But the tablet does not end there, because not everyone died, and not everyone stayed. The refugees. The tablet is very specific that during the 40 years of warning, and continuing for some time after the weapon was used, a portion of the coastal populations left the planet. How they left, the record describes only in outline. It uses a term the four scholars translated as the vessels of departure, and it says these vessels had been in storage on the second continent for a very long time before they were needed, kept in working condition by successive generations who had never expected to use them, and had, in some cases, forgotten what they were for. The vessels were understood to be older than the coastal civilizations themselves, left behind, in all likelihood, by the ones who came before the coming. The same builders who raised the star-aligned structures on the interior peaks. The people of the coast did not build their own escape, they inherited it. The tablet says the vessels went to 3 places. Some went outward, into the darkness beyond the 4th planet, and the record says nothing more about them. Some went to what the tablet calls the sunward world with the yellow air, which the 4 scholars believed was Venus, at a period when Venus may have carried a thicker and stranger atmosphere than it does now. Of those 2, the record says nothing more, and some, the tablet is very clear about this, came to the 3rd planet from the Sun, to Earth. The ones who came here were mostly of the second people, the small ones with copper skin, the most technologically advanced of the 3, the builders of the vertical city at the river mouth. The tablet gives numbers, and the numbers are small. A few thousand individuals at most spread across a handful of arrival sites that the 4 scholars tentatively placed in the eastern Mediterranean and southern Anatolia. This was not a migration. This was a remnant. And they did not arrive as conquerors. The tablet is careful here. They arrived exhausted, damaged, with only a fraction of what they had carried from the 4th planet still functional. And they arrived among a human population that was already here, already numerous, already living its own history. The refugees had a plan. The tablet says they intended to hide what they had brought, wait, recover, and rebuild something like their old civilization in a quiet corner of the new world. That plan lasted less than a generation. The humans they had landed among were more numerous than expected, and more curious. Contact was made. And the refugees, being few, damaged, and, the tablet implies, unbearably lonely, allowed some of what they carried to be seen. What they carried included records, technical records, astronomical records, the account of what had happened to their world. And it included a small number of objects the tablet calls the teaching devices. Physical objects designed to pass knowledge from one generation to the next without loss. Knowledge began to move from the refugee population into the human one, and within a few generations the refugees ceased to exist as a separate people. They were not destroyed, they were absorbed. Their descendants were, in every visible way, human, but those descendants carried the memory. The tablet is careful, almost legalistic, about what the refugees gave and what they did not. Metallurgy was already here when they arrived. Agriculture was already here. Stone building was already here. The tablet denies the refugees credit for all of it. What they brought, what had not existed here before, was a way of watching the sky. The tracking of slow motions across generations, the use of fixed stars as reference points against which slower drifts could be measured, and above all one idea, that the sky itself can carry a warning, that certain changes overhead can be read as a message about what is coming. That way of seeing, the tablet says, was the refugee gift. It did not exist in that region before the arrival. It exists everywhere now. The tablet itself, according to the 4 scholars, was written by one of the descendants, set down in Sumerian thousands of years after the arrival, by someone preserving what had been an oral tradition passed mouth to mouth for generations, and the writer knew the tradition was decaying. The closing lines say 2 things plainly. First, that the record is incomplete. Details had been lost. Some passages are reconstruction, done in good faith by people who felt the memory dimming. This is why the tablet contradicts itself in small ways, and the scholars marked every contradiction rather than smoothing it over. The contradictions, they wrote, are the fingerprint of a real tradition. Fabrications are consistent, memories are not. Second, the record was written down because the writers believed it would happen again, not necessarily to Earth, not necessarily soon, but they believed the pattern that ended their ancestors' world was a pattern that repeats, and they preserved the checklist the skywatchers had used. Slow dimming of certain stars, slow reddening, small shifts in the timing of periodic events in the sky. and on the ground, changes in the behaviour of the atmosphere and the oceans of the world under threat. Unusual patterns of storm behaviour, changes in the composition of the upper air, unusual observations at the edge of what the tablet calls the outer shell. The four scholars, before their journal folded in 1987, had matched several checklist items against phenomena documented in the 20th century. They did not publish the matches. Their notes say they intended to. The notes were never released. What survives is the checklist itself, and the knowledge that four careful people looked at it, looked at our own records, and decided the comparison was worth finishing. The tablet ends with a single sentence. The four scholars agreed on its translation without argument, and then they placed it as the epigraph of their 1985 paper. In English, the line reads, "Remember the coast, because the coast is where it ends." That is the last thing the writer said. After that, the clay is blank. If any of this reached you, if the picture of the three oceans and the green band and the towers taller than the cliffs at the edge of the world sat down inside you and stayed, leave the word coast in the comments. It is a small thing, it helps this record reach the people who are ready for it. And subscribe if you have not. There are more tablets in this collection. The next one describes the inside of the vessels of departure. According to the second most damaged tablet from Nippur, it is a strange record. Be here for it.